Right, today we're going to go through your fifth Histopod for your revision on Richard and John. As you can see from the screen, there have been two sections you completed already of the three. The first one was looking at life and government in England, looking at society, towns, what life was like in the countryside, how they ruled, and finances. The second one was involvement overseas, 1189 to 1204, so the Crusades to when John finally lost Normandy in 1204. This last section, this Histopod and the next one, are going to be looking at King John's downfall from 1205 to 1216. Firstly, we're going to be looking at how he fell out with the Pope. Then we're going to be looking at how his relations with the barons got worse during this time period. Next one is going to be looking at Magna Carta and Civil War, and finally the succession. So we can link these things together really for this section of the course. Why did John fall out with the barons in this period? Well, we know he fell out with the barons because firstly, he fell out with the Pope. And secondly, because he was cruel when raising money to get France back after he lost it in 1204. He also misused the justice system for his own gains, in partly to raise finances. We also know that after all these fundraising, he still failed to regain Normandy in 1214. So in this section, we see him falling out with the barons because of a variety of reasons. On the screen, you should be able to see now how he fell out with the Pope. So the dispute with the papacy overlaps the barons' plot, which is the next section for today. The first bit is the dispute with the papacy, which goes from 1205 to 1213. The causes of the dispute will be covered, looking at how disagreement over who should choose Archbishop of Canterbury and the choice of Archbishop of Canterbury. The second bit looks at the impact of the interdict and excommunication on King John and the people in this country. The last bit looks at how he finally reconciled with the Pope and the significance of this reconciliation in terms of the bigger picture. So what were the causes and outcomes of John's dispute with the papacy? Well, the big picture is on the board. The first bit is the fact that they had a dispute over who should appoint the Archbishop of Canterbury, which lasted between 1205 and 1207. We then had the Pope placing an interdict on Britain and eventually excommunicating John. Finally, we have a reconciliation in 1213 between the Pope and King John, which actually ended up benefiting both King and Pope in the longer term. So the dispute itself, the timelines on the board, as you probably did it in your lesson a while ago now, we can see that originally John decided that he wanted to appoint the Archbishop of Canterbury after Hubert Walter passed away. Hubert Walter was quite a character as Archbishop of Canterbury. He actually went on the Crusades with John and helped him to raise lots of people, with Richard, apologies, and raise lots of people to go with him as well. So Hubert Walter, who's done a great job for Richard, and John till now has sadly passed away. So King John thinks it's his turn to choose an Archbishop of Canterbury, the most important position in the church in England, and the church being a very powerful institution. So King John decided that a man named John de Grey, who was Bishop of Norwich, should have the job. And he told the monks of Canterbury his choice. The monks of Canterbury disagreed, and they decided that one of their own men, a monk called Reginald, should actually be put in charge. Because of this dispute, the Pope ended up being asked to resolve the problem. And after summing up and looking at both candidates, he actually chose his own person, a man named Stephen Langton. John didn't like the idea of Stephen Langton, and there's a number of reasons for this. He refused to accept Langton because he's not his choice in the first place, but also because he'd had a lot to do with the king in France and had been stationed in Paris for a long time. And if you think about it, John has just lost Normandy to the French king, who this person is obviously quite close to. So it's almost like having an enemy within his own country in a very important position. So that you can understand in a way why John refused to accept Langton. However, the Pope basically made him Archbishop anyway, and so John refused to let him come to England. He expelled the monks from Canterbury, seized the land from the Italian clergy in England, and basically the Pope, because of this, placed in England under an interdict to punish the country for what John had done in refusing to accept his decision. As you can see, there were reasons for this decision on both sides. As I said, John thought he should choose. His father and his brother had both chosen, so why shouldn't he? The monks of Canterbury are his subjects. They should do what they're told. And lastly, Stephen Langton, he's trusted because he's obviously friends with Philip of France. Whereas the Pope sees the conflict as messy, so resolves it with his own decision-making. He sees that the kings of Europe should obey him because he is actually higher than them, if you think about the hierarchy we were looking at. And lastly, Stephen Langton's intelligent, holy man, perfectly okay with capable of taking on this big position. There's a couple of points going on in the background that we need to be clear on. Innocent III became Pope at a very young age. He was only 37. I suppose not young when you consider the average age that people lived to at the time, but, still 37. He was determined to assert his authority, and things like making important appointments he saw as perfectly within his right to do so. So his choice of Langton for Archbishop of Canterbury was part of a bigger thing of Rome making attempts to stop European monarchs making religious appointments, making sort of asserting his will. In terms of the medieval church, we know that it's very powerful, and the church influenced all aspects of life. And the king also relied on income from taxes paid by the church, which then gave the church influence over the king. So although the king may be top of the feudal hierarchy in England, he still relies a lot on the church. So the interdict itself. The consequences of the interdict are perhaps not as far-reaching as the Pope would have hoped, but we do know that they were there, they existed, and they did cause upset and resentment among the population in England. You were not supposed to have sacraments. Well, sacraments were not provided for the dying, including any Holy Communion and anointing of the sick. They couldn't have Christian burials, so people were worried that the souls of dead wouldn't go to heaven, and they were often buried in common land or elsewhere, which was very upsetting for the family concerned because they were worried that their relative would be stuck in purgatory, like the waiting room before you go to heaven or hell. Marriages couldn't take place, baptisms had to take place sort of behind locked doors of the church, and sermons basically ended up being preached outside the church instead. We know that about 1209, the Pope relented to some extent, allowing clergy, monks and nuns to have mass behind the closed doors, but everyone else, most of your services now were done outside the church grounds, almost in defiance of what the Pope had expected to happen. King John actually benefited from the interdict. His reaction wasn't what the Pope had hoped. He punished those who he blamed for it, which were the clergymen who supported the Pope, and took the opportunity to basically gain money from the situation by basically confiscating these people's properties or anyone who left in protest at what he'd done. He confiscated their properties and basically took the money that went with the land. If the clergy wanted their property back, including their mistresses, they had to pay a lot of money to get it back. John's main focus was actually getting as much money as he could to try and regain France. So any opportunity for money gain, he was there, and the interdict turned out for him to be a money-making possibility. The impact itself on the people of England possibly wasn't as bad as the Pope had hoped. People were obviously affected and very upset and resentful of it, but actually it didn't affect lives as much as you would think. Priests still held services outside the church, sometime in the churchyard. We saw the clergy just ignoring it in some places and just carrying on as before. Prayer, fasting and celebrating and pilgrimages just carried on as they always had done. I suppose as we said, it's the lack of Christian burials where people were most worried, as they were most concerned for the souls of their dead loved ones, their family. So that's really sort of the main thing that concerned people. Most people of England sided with John rather than the Pope, and about 3 bishops left the country, but most of the clergy and most nobles just got on with it and supported John still. So as we can see, because John actually was profiting. He wasn't really being punished by the interdict. So was in no hurry to reconcile with the Pope because he was gaining lots of money from this situation. So Innocent III then excommunicated John as like the next level of punishment for John personally. So the interdict remained on England, and John personally was excommunicated on the 8th of November 1209. This basically meant that John was excluded from all sacraments, church services, and would basically go to hell when he died. It also actually was supposed to mean that, according to the church, his subjects no longer had to obey him, and they, in effect, had to choose between their loyalty to the church or their loyalty to the king. Most people chose the king, but with resentment for putting them in that situation. And basically, John responded to this by seizing even more church property and possessions. So it didn't really initially have the effect either that the Pope would hope. We do know that many of the barons, although resentful and discontented, and the church did try to get them to turn away from John, but they actually couldn't because of the feudal system that was in place. John could actually confiscate their land if they didn't fulfill their feudal duties to him. So basically, them and their families would have been ruined if they actually turned away from him because he'd been excommunicated. So they didn't really have a choice in the matter, to be honest. As we've said, John didn't submit. He grew richer. He was actually claiming income now from 7 bishoprics, which is an area a bishop is responsible for, and 7 abbacies, because the people in charge had left after John had fallen out the church or had confiscated their land. This was looking at about £13,500 per year from confiscated church property, which is a lot at that time. However, this situation of benefits didn't last because John actually felt threatened. Eventually. In May 1213, goodness me, John agreed to the Pope's peace terms and even agreed to become his vassal. This can be seen as a humiliation for John, but it was actually a very clever move because the reason he gave in at this point was because there were certain things going on in the background that had started to get him worried. As you can see, the plot of 1212, which we're going to be looking at shortly, which was basically a defeated plot by a number of barons to actually have him killed, had failed. But he still was aware that the barons were against him and he lacked allies in England and elsewhere in Europe. So if he reconciled with the Pope, he would have a very powerful ally after all of this. And also by 1213, England was going to possibly be invaded by King Philip's eldest son, Louis, Prince Louis, because Louis and Philip could claim because John had been excommunicated, England was no longer being run by anyone involved in the church. So it was ripe for a crusade to take it over and put it back in the bosom of the church. So we have this situation where he's threatened in his own country, and he's also threatened from outside of his own country. So now he actually has to give in. But in giving in, he didn't lose everything. He actually gained quite a bit. Although it was expensive, he did gain quite a bit. He actually himself presented his crown and became basically showed his submission to the Pope by sort of presenting his crown to the Pope's representative, the Pope's legate, in England, which is an important act in itself. Okay, so the terms of the reconciliation. In early 1213, he sent envoys to the Pope to agree terms. And Innocent said that the interdict and excommunication would be lifted if John met the following. Stephen Langton would become Archbishop of Canterbury. Any church person who'd fled could come back and have their property back. John was to pay £8,000 immediately to the Pope and £27,000 eventually overall. If John broke the agreement, he'd lose his right to appoint people to church offices forever. John not only agreed to these terms, he actually went further and surrendered to the papacy, the kingdoms of England and Ireland. Basically, he became a vassal of the Pope, which meant the Pope, so his kingdom became a fief, or a land that the Pope was in charge of. He also promised an annual payment of 1,000 marks to the papacy. This is an important move, and this is part of how he actually benefited. We see that Innocent III is delighted. He thinks he's been victorious. John has submitted to him, and the reconciliation has basically placed England, however, under the Pope's protection, which is important. Basically, because England is now under the Pope's protection and John is now a vassal of the Pope, he is protected in a number of ways. Basically, Philip II's forces can't invade with Prince Louis because attacking John would be like attacking the Pope, which you don't want to be doing. It gave John and England a very important ally against any future attacks or invasion because the Pope, again, is important and standing by John. And it's an ally for any other problems that might arise in his kingdom, which is very significant when we look at what happened with Magna Carta in 1215. So there we go. We had a dispute over who should be Archbishop of Canterbury, which led to an interdict being placed on England. And because it didn't really work, John was excommunicated. That initially didn't work either until he felt threatened by outside and internal pressures, the 1212 rebellion and the 1212 plot, and Prince Louis's possible invasion, so which led to a reconciliation. As we said, the Pope won in some ways because he got Stephen Langton there, got quite a lot of money from John. The interdict was then removed from some of the money being paid to start with. The bishops and abbots who'd left got their property back. However, John now has a very powerful ally, which, although it's expensive for him, means that he has some very important support against any possible internal to England or external to England invasion threats or sort of uprisings. So the next step then is to look at how and why John's relationship with the barons actually got worse. There's a number of reasons why it got worse. The first is the way money was raised. It became very cruel, the way that John tried to raise money over this time to get Normandy back. We're talking more in detail about the plot of 1212 against him. And lastly, John's failure to capture Normandy in 1214. So as you can see, you've got those three themes on the board. We start with his unpopularity. We need money to regain France. So we've got the steep rises in taxes, severe punishments for non-payment, and his misusing the justice system, as selling justice, his arbitrary use of power in the justice system, where he was accused of selling justice to make more money. We see then some developments in the plot of 1212, while John was trying to take parts of Wales back that Prince Llewellyn had taken from him. There was a plot to kill him by a number of powerful barons, including Eustace de Vesci and Robert Fitzwalter, who were both in debt to him, but this failed. However, after this, John did actually become concerned and relax some of his demands and reconcile with the Pope. We then move on to the last section, which is his failure to recapture Normandy after raising all that money and making people incredibly angry. He managed to fail miserably to beat Philip in France, despite having a very powerful ally in the Holy Roman Emperor Otto. But at the Battle of Bouvines, he sadly lost and then had to return to England, knowing that basically Normandy was now completely out of his grasp. So there we go. John's fallen out with the Pope, lost Normandy, decided to launch a war of reconquest and needed money, so increased the tax demands and was happy to torture them and their families if they didn't pay. John, on top of all of this, has a slightly bigger financial problem because while he's trying to raise money to gain France back, inflation or the price of goods is instead rising. We're actually going through a period of inflation at the moment. We can see that there was a steady rise in prices at these times, which lowered the amount of things he could buy with the money he had. So he needed even more money than he would have done before to gain Normandy back, or to try and gain Normandy back. On top of that, the loss of Normandy had actually led to a loss of revenue because all the land and the finances, etc., that could have been gathered by him and his barons from that was no longer available to them. On top of that, he was also seen to have quite a lavish lifestyle. It was reported that in 1205, £700 was spent on robes that he wore to a Christmas feast, which is quite annoying to many people at the time, considering a typical knight's fee was barely £20 a year that they were gaining. Right, so to raise money, he imposed fines on his barons, and they were quite cruel and quite controlling in their nature, in terms of trying to shape who they married and how they married, and he seemed to want to have hand in their lives in a very personal level. For example, he fined one baron £810, 12 horses for marrying an heiress, and then he seized their lands because they didn't have a king's license to get married. He commonly charged £405 as a fine just to inherit your own feudal lands. Previously, it would have been £100. And basically, it's little wonder that they started to lose patience with John. They saw his taxation policy as unreasonable. And you will see that in the government and finances section there were things like the 13th use and scutage that he used to raise money as well, which is actually causing a lot of resentment. We see that in John's reign, inflation was also caused by debasement of the coinage. We see the fact that people were clipping coins to create new ones because they were actually made of the metal that they say they were. So silver coins, etc., were silver, and you clip the silver off and eventually melt it down and create new coins. This meant that the coins you did have had less weight, so less value, and there were more coins available, which meant people were demanding, which lowered the current's value. So it meant you needed to have more to buy more. Think about when you were looking at hyperinflation and printing more money. Well, it's like a similar idea. Okay. He was also accused of using his power arbitrarily. This basically means he's using his own personal prejudices and opinions to run the country, or basically the key thing they link it to is run the judiciary or the justice system. Basically, the king could be said to use his power in an arbitrary way if they'd arrested someone who had annoyed them. There's no evidence against them, it's just they don't like them, so they'd had them arrested. And basically what happened was the process of law was completely ignored. And if you remember when we looked at what a medieval king was supposed to be, part of that was supposed to be someone who's fair and was protective of the justice system to keep it fair. He impacted on the judicial ire. This has involved a judge from the royal courts visiting local courts and hearing cases to ensure the king's justice was being put into practice across the whole kingdom. 1209 to 1214, so overlapping what was going on with the church, John basically closed down all the law courts and the judiciaries in the counties. Only his approved judges were permitted to hear cases, and John basically had taken control of the justice system and used it for his own benefit. Basically, him and his justices could be bribed to mete out decisions based on who offered them the most. And if a baron... So you can clearly see that the system was not fair and it wasn't being run on a fair basis to gain money. Also, there was seen that unjust and completely unexcusable pain was delivered onto families who who went against him. So if a baron couldn't repay his debts, John would make their lives a misery. And we see that with the example of William de Braos. William was actually one of John's favourites early on, and he had lands in England, Wales, and Ireland, a very powerful band of John's barons. However, during 1207, he claimed that John actually said that de Braos owed him money for the lands that he held, and he was told to hand over his sons as hostage until the debt was paid. Now, his wife resented this. His wife did not want them handed over because she was concerned about their fate in John's hands. And part of the sort of rumour goes that she was actually concerned about their fate into John's hands because she'd been there and heard John order the death of Prince Arthur. And so it was really concerning to her. Basically, because they were so concerned, de Braos left his lands and went into exile. And as they were leaving, his wife and eldest son were captured, put in prison, and actually starved to death. Now, while the barons thought that John was acting so unjustly and cruelly, they were very aware that there was very little chance of them actually getting any kind of justice. He in the feudal system as a king, had the highest authority in terms of justice, and so there was nowhere else to turn. He also remained in England this whole time. So whereas Richard had managed the sum total of, the huge sum total of 6 months in England for his whole reign, John was in England all that time and annoying them from 1205 to 1214. So there was no one else the barons could blame for their mistreatment or problems as they may have done previously. So his arbitrary use of power, his demands for taxes and his fines prompted some barons to start plotting against him, which is where you see the plot of 1212 coming in. While John was away leading campaigns to get his land back, it was basically lands that he'd given to William de Braos, and he wanted them back. So he sort of had to go himself to fight to get them back and take control of them again. He found that while he was away, he became very aware that there was sort of a plot against him in the background. So John was away. He'd invaded Wales. He'd forced Prince Llewellyn into submission, demanded the prince handed over his sons as hostage to guarantee good behaviour. Hadn't really succeeded there because it wasn't really enough to deter Prince Llewellyn, because in 1212 he actually made an agreement with Philip II to work with the French against John. So while John was preparing to sort this out, he learned about Llewellyn's deal with some of his barons as well. These barons had actually plotted to kill John. Eustace de Vesey and Robert Fitzwalter were two very powerful men that were believed to owe John money, and basically angered, according to rumours, by John trying to seduce female relations when he'd visited at times. John was concerned. He really understood the seriousness of his situation because he was concerned that his barons were turning against him. He didn't want that sort of threats within his own country. So he pulled away from the attack on Wales and marched north to re-establish his position. Fitzwilliam and de Vesey fled. The plot was basically failed. He wasn't killed. The two main people involved had gone. But it was a wake-up call for John. And after defeating them, he did relax some of his demands on taxes. And this is when also it was believed that he made his deal with the Pope. And below on the screen, and if you look through the PowerPoint, you've got some information about both of these men and why they actually fell out with John, linked to sort of one's wife being seduced, his another daughter, and annoyance over debts and refusal to pay particular fines. So the next thing we need to look at is John's failed attempt to regain Normandy in 1214. John's main focus was on regaining his lands on the continent. All these harsh taxes were being used to raise funds for his campaign in France. The plot of 1212 and the threat of Louis's invasion, as we said earlier, had encouraged John to reach an agreement with the Pope. And by 1214, he wasn't so concerned about invasion overseas because of his agreement with the Pope. He wasn't so concerned about an uprising from his own people because of his agreement with the Pope. So in 1214, John felt ready to launch his campaign. He was sure that if he won back his lands, then he could rebuild his relationship with his barons and basically give them a chance to gain land and wealth, so their just rewards if he recaptured Normandy. So it would improve everyone's financial position and make everyone happy. He really needed this to work. However, if he failed, it would be pretty much impossible to restore any relationship with the barons, especially as he demanded so many taxes and fines to fund his campaign. So what we do know is that in February 1214, John set sail for France. Not many of his barons accompanied him, but he took a lot of money with him to buy mercenary soldiers. We know that he spent around £135,000 on the campaign, and this huge sum had basically been created by all these fines and taxes, and also an 11th scutage, which is, that many scutages is unheard of. Scutage was what you paid, so you didn't have to go to fight yourself. And this final scutage, I think, had put a lot of the barons' noses out of joint. This final one in 1214. So this was a real concern for John for if he was unsuccessful. John, in gaining any kind of success, was very reliant on support from European allies, because it was believed without them he'd be completely unable to defeat Philip II. On the 27th of July, 1214, I'll change it on the slides, a battle was fought at Bouvines. John's main ally, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV, led an army against Philip. Otto's army did have some of John's men in it, and it did outnumber the French army. However, despite all of this, the French defeated Otto's army, and that defeat ended any of John's hopes of restoring the Angevin rule to Normandy, as in getting it back for him and his barons. He returned home with nothing to show for the heavy taxes he'd taken from them, and many of the barons now became incredibly rebellious, and ultimately many people believe that scutage, that 11th scutage in 1214, and John's defeat led to baronial rebellion being prepared to get Magna Carta together, actually having a civil war against him and looking elsewhere. This was ultimately the turning point or the moment for John's downfall, to become sort of secured, I suppose. There's a couple of videos there if you want to have a look at them, which just overview what happened in terms of the battle. They're on the slides provided for you. A little bit more information at the battle. You can see that Bouvines is near Lille in France. Basically, John had tried to divide Philip's forces, and Otto and his Flemish allies were supposed to be attacking Paris. However, Philip forced Otto and some of John's forces to meet them at the Battle of Bouvines. And basically, the skilled and heavily male French knights managed to overcome or beat the knights on Otto and John's side. And this rather confusing encounter ensued, which led to Otto fleeing, failing, and he actually lost power himself in 1215 because of this failure. Basically, at this point, John's got no chance of getting Normandy and many of his French lands back. So there's 5 key impacts that we need to be aware of John's failure to regain Normandy. He'd lost the revenues permanently, so he was not going to get any money from Normandy anymore. He couldn't reward the barons with land for their services to him. He'd wasted the largest scutage ever raised in 1214 and all the other money that had been raised. John's barons were incredibly angry and jealous, and also rebellious. That was what I was looking for. And he basically failed in his role as a warrior. His nickname of Soft Sword was completely stuck with him now. He was seen as rubbish in battle. He couldn't even win, despite having, all these people, all this money at his side. So, 2 things we've looked at today. Then the dispute with the papacy, caused by a disagreement over who should be Archbishop of Canterbury, and John refusing Stephen Langton, which was the Pope's choice. We then know that England was placed under an interdict where no religious services were allowed, which John actually profited from, didn't really have the effect that they planned. So John was excommunicated in 1209, but the king was chosen over the church by many people resentfully, but partly because they had to, because of the feudal system. The reconciliation took place because of concerns about internal rebellion from the barons, external possible invasion from Prince Louis. So he did make peace terms with the Pope, became his vassal, but this actually benefited him as well because he then gained the protection of the Pope. John's relationship with the barons went from bad to worse. We know his raising of taxes was incredibly unpopular. Wardship fines raising by 300%. In 1207, he tried a 13th tax, the scutages that he raised, but also basically the severe punishments for non-payment of debt. William de Braos's family being a prime example. He also was seen to misuse the justice system as a way of gaining more money, so as seen as selling justice. This led to, as well as personal resentment to John, led to the plot of 1212. While he was in Wales trying to sort of take land back from Prince Llewellyn, there was a plot to kill him by a number of his powerful barons, but it failed. However, John was aware that because of this, he needed to relax his tax demands a little bit because of the amount of resentment against him, and he did reconcile with the Pope. to sort of make this better and get himself the backing of the Pope, which was quite a clever plan, it turned out. The impact of his failure to gain Normandy, well, that's a loss of a lot of money, a loss of a chance to get his barons' favour back. A lot of finances were wasted. Basically, his reputation as a soft sword has been cemented into place, and it saw basically him and his allies defeat, and eventually both being, well, one being hounded out of power, the other one dying as part of a civil war going on in the background to take over from him. So that's the end of this PowerPoint, and that's the end of Histopod 5. Thank you for listening.